Hi, my name is Jenna Anderson. I am 33 years old and a financial analyst living in Denver, Colorado. On a chilly Thanksgiving afternoon in Portland, I returned home after years of distance, carrying a fragile hope for a warm family dinner. The house was filled with the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and freshly baked apple pie. Everything seemed cozy and normal until my mother placed a red velvet box in front of me. She smiled, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "A special gift just for you." I opened it and my heart stopped. Inside was not jewelry, not a keepsake, but a bank debt notice for $450,000 in the name of Daria, the perfect little sister they had always protected. My father looked at me, his voice cold as ice. "You will pay." I clenched my fists and shook my head. "No, this is not my responsibility." In an instant, he threw a glass of red wine straight into my face while my mother screamed, "Get out of this house." I stood up, my whole body trembling but my back straight. And just as I was about to leave, the door opened and a stranger stepped in, and the words he was about to speak made the whole room fall silent. "What would you do if your own family treated you like a walking wallet?" Tell me where you are listening to this story from, because I want to know how far this story can travel in this wide world. I stood still in the room, bathed in soft yellow light falling over the long dining table, my face still streaked with the dark red wine my father had thrown. The entire room was frozen, and in that moment, memories of my childhood flooded back like a cold wave crashing over my mind. I realized that this moment was not a surprise at all. It was the inevitable end point of a long chain of injustice and pain I had endured. From the earliest years of my life, I learned that in this house, love and fairness were never divided equally. My sister, Daria, was always the center of every joy, every expectation, and every privilege. I remember her 10th birthday when my parents rented out a big restaurant, decorated it with balloons, a 3-tier cake, and a crowd of friends running around the yard. Daria wore a pale pink princess dress with a plastic crown glittering on her head, smiling brightly like a star. And me, at 12, I sat in the corner helping my mother carry cakes, cleaning up paper plates, and picking crumbs off the floor. No one remembered my birthday 2 weeks earlier, except for a small store-bought cake and my father's remark, "You're older now, stop asking for things like a child." In every trip, in every plan, Daria was always the main character. I remember when our family went to Disneyland when I was 14. Airplane tickets, hotels, souvenirs, everything was for her. I was not allowed to bring a friend, because my parents said, "We need to save money." Yet, when Daria whined for a princess doll set that cost over $100, they swiped the card without hesitation. And me? The only thing I got was a discounted baseball cap from the last gift shop, as if that could patch over the imbalance. By the time I was a teenager, I understood that I could not rely on them even for the most basic things. I started working part-time at 16, waiting tables in a small cafe near school, studying and working late into the night. I still remember the numbness in my legs after every shift, my hands smelling of coffee and dish soap. When I came home, my father's only question was, "How much did you make? Hand it over, your sister needs books tomorrow." But I knew that money was never truly spent on her books. It vanished into expensive dinners, Daria's new shoes, or family vacations I was not allowed to attend because I was told, "You need to stay home and watch the house. I'm sick." Each time, the same familiar line echoed, becoming the refrain that haunted my childhood, "Jenna will handle it." When Daria needed money for a prom dress, I was the one quietly taking on extra shifts. When my father lost his job for a short while, I put aside my dream of joining the science club and worked evenings as a cashier, handing over money to help them pay the bills. When my mother complained about not having enough for a summer vacation, I emptied my savings meant for books so they could leave happily on their trip. I was the shield, the living bank, the child onto whose shoulders every responsibility was placed without question. During my college years, I thought things might change. I was accepted into an economics program in Denver with a partial scholarship, but the costs were still heavy. I worked while studying, juggling everything from rent to textbooks. I hoped that at the very least, once I proved myself capable, they would finally be proud of me. But on the very day of my graduation, when I walked across the stage to receive my bachelor's degree, my father only patted my shoulder and said to a few relatives, "This one's smart. She'll make money to take care of Daria." In his eyes, my success was never my own. It was just another tool to sustain the perfect little world they had built around my younger sister. Daria was different. She grew up in absolute indulgence, given everything she wanted. She got her first car the moment she turned 16, while I rode an old bicycle to school. She had her own fun to travel through Europe with friends after graduating high school, while I quietly signed on for more summer overtime shifts. She never had to worry about a single day of bills or tuition, because either I or our parents were always there to take care of it. And every time she was pampered like that, all I ever received in return was a cold look, as if that responsibility was naturally mine and didn't require a word of thanks. There was one time, when I was 22, I asked my father if I could keep part of my summer earnings to buy a laptop for school. He looked at me and frowned. "A computer can be shared. Don't be selfish. Daria needs to sign up for French lessons. Give her the money." I stayed silent, nodded, and went back to working late nights. By then, I had begun to understand clearly. I had never been a daughter in the true sense. In this family, I was just the one who solves the financial problems. The memories piled up, from the times I quietly paid my sister's tuition to the times I covered my mother's credit card debt so the family wouldn't get collection calls. No one ever asked me, "Are you tired?" or "Do you want to keep something for yourself?" Everyone simply assumed my sacrifices were natural, unquestionable. And that haunting phrase, repeated like a curse, clung to me. "Gina will handle it." For nearly 10 years, I was absent from almost every family holiday, Christmas, Thanksgiving, even the summer reunions where I had once been the one running around, clearing plates for others. I chose avoidance. I made excuses about work, about business trips, but in truth it was self-protection. I no longer had the strength to sit at that long table, listening to comparisons, feeling the glances heavy with implication, and hearing the cold remarks that erased all my efforts. But then, one October morning, as the maple leaves outside my Denver apartment window turned brilliant gold, I received a message from my mother. Just a single short line. "Come home for Thanksgiving, we miss you." All. I read that message over and over again, dozens of times. In every word, I didn't hear the echo of motherly love, but rather something else artificial, forced, yet it still shook me. It had been so long since I last heard my mother say I was missed. A part of me desperately wanted to believe that maybe time had changed them. Maybe, at last, my family truly wanted a reunion. Rachel, my best friend, was the first person I told about that message. We met in New York, working together at a financial analysis firm during the early years of our careers. Rachel, an American of Jewish heritage, was practical, sharp, and always saw straight through what I tried to hide. After listening, she simply raised an eyebrow, sighed, and said one line that left me silent. "Jenna, they only call when they need money. Don't let longing become a trap again." I knew Rachel was right. Over the years, my family had only ever reached out when there was financial trouble. When Daria wanted to launch a fashion business, when my father's career ran into problems, when my mother wanted to remodel the kitchen, I was always the one summoned. This message was nothing but another loop in that same cycle. And yet, my heart did not fully obey reason. Deep inside me was a place that still held the scent of the pumpkin pie my mother used to bake when I was in elementary school, that still remembered my father's booming laughter as he told old stories in our small kitchen, that once believed I might someday be seen as a true part of the family. I had grown up with the yearning to sit in that kitchen without worrying about bills, without tensing at favoritism, simply allowing my heart to rest. That yearning, though extinguished many times, still flared to life the moment I read my mother's message. I spent many sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. Rachel had texted me again, "If you go, at least be prepared. Remember, they can't hurt you unless you allow them to." Her words echoed in my mind as I packed my bags, booked a flight, canceled it, and finally decided to drive. I thought maybe the long road trip would give me time to reflect, to help me stay calm. I set out from Denver a day earlier, when the city was still wrapped in fog. I drove my SUV through snow-capped mountains, endless pine forests, and highways that seemed to stretch on forever. On the radio, Christmas songs were already playing, even though the holiday season was still weeks away. I listened as I thought about my family, about memories that were both bitter and sweet. I remembered the first time my mother taught me how to bake an apple pie, her hand resting gently over mine as she said, "Don't be afraid to make mistakes, just try." In that moment, I believed she truly loved me. But that memory was quickly overshadowed by the scolding I received for ruining the crust, while Daria was praised simply because she looked adorable just watching. The jumble of memories tightened my chest, filling me with both longing and fear. After more than 18 hours of driving, passing through small towns, roadside gas stations, and stretches of highway that carried echoes of my childhood, Portland finally appeared, draped in its familiar drizzle and gray skies. I drew in a deep breath and told myself, this time will be different. At the very least, I will try to forgive, to step into that house once more with a heart free of resentment. I knew I might be wrong. I knew Rachel would probably be disappointed that I hadn't heeded her warning. But in that moment, I just wanted to believe there was still one chance left to call that place family. The tires rolled slowly along the familiar suburban street, yellow leaves slick with rain scattered beneath the trees. I recognized every corner, every house I used to pass by on my bike each morning on the way to school. And when I turned onto the small street where my childhood home came into view, my heart began pounding hard against my chest. The lights inside were already on, warm golden light spilling through the windows just like it had years ago. I stopped the car and sat still for a few minutes, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. A part of me wanted to turn back, but another voice whispered, "Forgiveness isn't about whether they deserve it. It's about whether you need to try for yourself." Although I opened the door, inhaled the damp chill of late autumn in Portland, and stepped out. The scent of wet wood and fallen leaves swept over me. I walked slowly toward the house, trembling yet hopeful, like the child I once was returning to the old kitchen. The front door opened, and the moment I stepped inside, I was enveloped by the aroma of roasted turkey, the warmth of cinnamon mingling with the sweetness of freshly baked apple pie. It was the familiar fragrance of my childhood, the one that once made me believe my family was no different from any other American family celebrating the holidays. But now, as I breathed it in deeply, it no longer felt like comfort, only a sugary layer covering bitter memories. The living room was decorated with pine wreaths and a few candles glowing softly in golden light. Everything looked like a picture-perfect postcard, the kind of scene anyone would assume belonged to a happy family gathered for Thanksgiving. My parents stepped out from the kitchen, their smiles so wide they bordered on forced. My mother rushed forward and hugged me, her arms squeezing tighter than necessary, as though she wanted to prove to anyone watching that we were close. My father hugged me too, giving my back a quick pat before letting go, his eyes flashing something unreadable. I knew, in those embraces, there was no genuine affection, only a performance to cover the emptiness between us. "Jenna, you're home," my mother said in a trembling voice, but I could hear the strain beneath every syllable. From the staircase, Daria descended like a star on the red carpet. She wore a pearl-colored silk dress, her hair styled in glossy waves, sparkling earrings catching the light. Beside her was her husband, Ethan. He wore a deep navy suit, a wine-colored tie, polished shoes, and a smile that looked rehearsed, as though he were about to pitch to a room full of investors. But beneath that polished exterior, I knew the truth. Ethan was a real estate businessman drowning in debt. Failed projects piled up one after another, rumors of bank loans and gambling losses in Vegas were well known in certain circles. I had even heard from an old friend at a bank that Ethan was flagged as a high-risk client. Yet here, in this house, they appeared as the perfect couple, while my parents looked at them with pride, as if my sister had married a millionaire. Dinner began, the long table covered with traditional dishes. Golden roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and a tray of freshly baked apple pie filling the air with its sweet aroma. I sat down, forcing a smile, trying to believe that if I focused on the food and old memories, I might feel at ease. But soon the questions started falling, each one sharp as a tiny blade against my skin. "Gina, how's work in Denver? I heard you got promoted?" My father began, his eyes carrying not genuine interest but calculation. "How much have you managed to save?" my mother added, her voice gentle but laced with curiosity. "I heard financial analysts like you can make close to 6 figures a year, is that right?" Ethan smirked, his gaze probing me as if trying to read the balance in my bank account. Daria chimed in, her tone half admiring and half envious. "You must have an investment plan by now, right? Have you thought about putting money into real estate?" I forced down a dry bite of turkey, my stomach tightening. They didn't ask if I was well, if I was happy, if I had someone in my life. Not a single word about friends or joy. Every question circled back to work, income, money. I began to see more clearly than ever that this dinner wasn't a reunion at all, it was a financial interrogation. Each time I answered, they exchanged glances, silent signals passing between them, as if piecing together fragments of data to build a picture of my assets. I felt less like a daughter, less like a sister, not even a guest at their table. I was a living financial report. I sat there, smiling stiffly, the clatter of cutlery striking each other echoing sharp and cold in my ears. Inside, unease rose with every breath, like an invisible hand tightening around my throat. At first, it was just scattered questions about my work. But then my parents began steering the conversation towards something far more deliberate. My father set down his fork, his voice slow but weighted with meaning. "You know, in a family, the most important thing is unity. Brothers and sisters must lift each other up. When there's hardship, you carry it together. That's what blood means." The one. My mother picked it up immediately, her eyes fixed on me, soft yet pressing. "Gina, your success is the pride of this family. But success must be shared. No one can truly be happy alone, right, dear?" I sat frozen, the fork and knife in my hands icy cold. I realized that the way they used the word family wasn't to comfort, it was to accuse, to corner me before I even had a chance to defend myself. I had grown up with that refrain, and now it returned, a reminder that they always had a reason to load the burden onto my shoulders. Daria rested her hand on the table, smiling softly, her wavy hair swaying with each movement. "Honestly, we didn't want to bother you," she said, her voice sweet but dripping with implication. "It's just that Ethan and I are facing some temporary setbacks with our real estate project. The capital is already in, but the bank, well, you know how they are, they don't understand long-term vision. We just need to get through the next few months, and then everything will stabilize." She lingered on the word temporary as though it were just a passing breeze, but her glittering eyes turned to me, expectant. Ethan jumped in immediately, his tone laced with forced humor. "Of course, Jenna, you're no stranger to numbers. You're a financial expert, after all. You understand that real estate needs cash flow. And you—" He paused, took a sip of wine, smirked as if debating whether to say it outright, and then dropped the words. "You've got over $800,000 in your account, don't you?" The fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto the plate, the sound ringing sharp across the table. My chest tightened. How did they know? That number wasn't something I had ever disclosed to anyone except my financial advisor and the bank. I blinked rapidly, scanning the faces around the table, trying to mask my shock. My parents sat there, calm, almost expectant, as if waiting for my confirmation. Daria lowered her gaze in feigned modesty, swirling her wine glass, while Ethan held my eyes with a look that was nothing short of a challenge. In that moment, I felt as if I were sitting in a courtroom and everyone around me was the jury. Only this jury wasn't seeking justice, they were seeking money. They had prepared in advance, had their numbers ready, had their plan laid out, and I, Jenna, was the prey. I drew a long breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "What are you talking about, Ethan?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Where did you get that information?" He shrugged as if it were nothing. "Rumors travel fast, especially when someone's successful. And sometimes a few numbers in the financial world aren't really secrets, even if it's not exact. You're not denying it, are you?" I clenched my teeth and stayed silent. In that instant, I could feel every pair of eyes fixed on me, waiting for me to speak, to confirm, to step into the trap. And my silence felt like an admission. At the end of the table, Grandpa Henry rested his hands on his cane, sitting still like a statue. But his eyes, old, deep, unblinking, followed every word and gesture. I met his gaze, and for a moment I saw him frown. Not at me, but at the words spilling from his son and daughter-in-law's mouths. Those eyes seemed to say, "I see everything, I understand." My mother placed her hand on the table, her voice softening but unable to hide the pressure behind it. "Jenna, you have the means. You can help your sister through this hardship. That's what an older sister should do. Family is for sharing, not for calculating." My father nodded, adding, "You must remember, when one person falls, the whole family feels the pain. But when one person succeeds, the whole family benefits. Are you really going to let your own sister and her husband lose everything when you could save them with just one signature?" Those words landed like a hammer. I sat there, feeling the blood pound in my head, each heartbeat slamming against my chest. I understood clearly now this was no longer a Thanksgiving dinner. This was a negotiation, and I had been cornered into it. They had staged the warm family setting, only to peel back the layers one by one, until all that remained were numbers, obligations, and crushing pressure. I lifted my glass of water, taking a sip to hide the trembling in my hand. In my mind, Rachel's voice rang out. "They only call when they need money." And now I knew just how right she had been. I, the one who once dreamed of a family gathering full of love, was nothing more than the central figure in a financial game they had scripted long before I arrived. The air in the room grew suffocating, every breath heavier than the last. I knew the real storm was still waiting ahead. Dinner ended in a heavy silence that was impossible to describe. The turkey platters were picked down to the bone, the apple pie half-eaten, yet no one seemed interested in food anymore. The clatter of cutlery had ceased, replaced by a quiet thick with unspoken expectation, eyes shifting toward me with calculated intent. I could feel the tension wrapping itself around me, as if everyone were waiting for the final act to drop the curtain on this charade. My mother was the first to break the silence. She stood, her lips curved in a half-smile, her voice trembling as though with genuine emotion. "Jenna, tonight we have something special for you," she said, then gave my father a small nod. He glanced at me before quietly pulling a red velvet box from under the table and placing it neatly in front of me. "This gift," my mother continued, "will bind our family together forever." I stared at the box, my heart racing, my mind flashing through possibilities. A family photo? A keepsake from childhood? Something symbolic, meant to show they truly wanted to reconcile? I wanted to believe that after all the questions about money, maybe this was their moment of sincerity. My fingers touched the cold, smooth velvet, trembling as I lifted the lid. In that instant, the entire room seemed to freeze. What lay inside was not jewelry, not a photo, not a sentimental token. It was a thick stack of papers, stamped with the familiar logo of a bank, and in bold print at the top, "Notice of debt $450,000. The name on it was not mine. It was Daria Anderson. The blood in my veins turned cold. I looked up at my mother, her eyes glistening with tears, her lips trembling. "Jenna, your sister made a mistake, but we are a family. You're her older sister, you can help her through this." Before I could respond, my father's voice cut in, sharp and commanding. "You will pay. That is what family does. That is what it means to be family." I glanced back down at the papers, then at Daria. She kept her head bowed, fingers idly turning the stem of her wine glass, her posture feigning regret. But the fleeting look I caught in her eyes told another story. There was no shame, only calculation, almost triumph. In that moment, I understood, this was no accident. This was a plan. Ethan dropped the pretense, leaning back in his chair, his voice brimming with confidence. Jenna, we know you can help. You've got over 800,000 in your account. We don't need all of it, just your signature here to cover this debt. We'll pay it back once the project turns around. It's only a matter of time. He spoke as if I were their personal bank, as if this had already been decided and there was no possible reason for me to refuse. I sat motionless, my eyes fixed on the thick stack of debt papers in front of me, each number cutting into my memory like a blade. In my head, the old refrain echoed 1,000 times. Jenna will handle it. So even after I had left, built a career, and lived independently, they still saw me as nothing more than a walking wallet, a safety net for Daria and Ethan's repeated failures. My hands trembled, but not from fear. I gripped the papers so tightly that my fingers turned white, my nails digging into the cardboard cover. My breath came fast and uneven, but inside me there rose a clarity I had never known before. I lifted my head, looked directly at my parents, at Daria and Ethan, and spoke, each word falling like a hammer. No, this is not my responsibility. The room shook as if I had uttered blasphemy. My father's face flushed crimson with rage. He shot up from his chair, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor, the wine glass in his hand trembling from his tightening grip. Ungrateful daughter, he roared, his voice thundering. And then, in a flash, he hurled the wine straight into my face. The dark red liquid splattered, soaking my hair, streaming down my cheek, seeping into my collar and dress. The burn of alcohol stung my skin, the smell sharp and suffocating, blurring my vision. I froze for a few seconds, not because of the sting, but because I realized this was the true ending. My father, the man who should have protected me, had chosen violence and humiliation over love. I slowly wiped my face with the back of my hand, smearing the streaks of red across my skin. My mother shot to her feet, her voice rising to a pitch so sharp it seemed to rattle the walls. Get out of this house. If you won't help your sister, you are not worthy to be our child. She spat, each word ground out, her eyes blazing as though I had betrayed something sacred. Daria shrank back in a show of trembling shoulders, but I caught the flash of satisfaction in her eyes. Ethan leaned into his chair, the corner of his mouth curling into a thin smile, his gaze saying, "We knew you'd resist, and we'll crush you for it." I drew in a deep breath, my body trembling but refusing to collapse. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, now distorted by anger and calculation. The flickering candles, the pine wreaths, the smell of turkey and apple pie, none of it was a symbol of Thanksgiving anymore. It had become the backdrop for an execution of the spirit. I set the stack of debt papers down on the table and pushed it back toward my parents. My voice came out rough but steady, carrying across the room like a strike of iron. If family love only exists when I'm paying for it, then it isn't family, it's a prison, and I'm not in it anymore. My mother's breath came in sharp bursts as she stomped her foot against the floor, pointing a finger straight at my face. You'll regret this. One day, when you fail, you'll crawl back here and beg. And when that day comes, I'll remember tonight. I lifted my head high, my eyes blurred by wine but burning with resolve. No, Mother. Today is the last day I let anyone in this house decide my worth. The tension was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. The faint clinking of trembling cutlery on the table, the ragged breaths of the relatives around us, everything was suspended in a pit of silence. The smell of red wine soaking into my skin reminded me that I had just crossed a threshold I could never return from. At the end of the table, Grandpa Henry still sat motionless, his gnarled hand resting on his cane. His eyes were sharp, tracking every detail of the scene, missing nothing. I saw him tilt his head and let out a faint sigh, as though what he had long suspected had finally revealed itself. And in that look, I sensed something was about to change. I pushed my chair back, the scraping against the hardwood sounding like something cracking open. I stood tall, my hair and face wet with red wine, but I did not bow my head. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady and firm, so firm it surprised even me. "But remember this, I don't owe anyone in this house a single thing." I turned and began to walk, each step heavy but certain. Behind me, the room sank into a deathly silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I thought, just one more step and I would leave this house forever. But then a sound rang out, sharp and resonant enough to freeze everyone in place. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of a cane striking the floor. Grandpa Henry finally spoke. The man with snow-white hair and eyes still bright with the sharpness of youth slowly rose at the end of the table. He leaned on his cane, his back slightly bent, but when his voice came, it was firm and commanding. "Jenna, you do not have to leave." Embers. I turned back, tears brimming in my eyes, staring at him in disbelief. He looked straight at me, then swept his gaze across the entire room, his words slicing through the thick air like a blade. "I've heard the rumors about this family for a long time, but today I've seen it with my own eyes. And I will not let this pass in silence any longer." The entire table went still. My father opened his mouth to speak, but the icy weight of Henry's gaze silenced him instantly. In that moment, all the control my parents thought they held vanished. Grandpa Henry, the man everyone respected, the moral pillar and keeper of the family's honor, had openly taken my side. He raised his hand slightly, and at once the sound of steady footsteps echoed from the front door. The door opened again, and a man entered. He wore a pinstriped gray suit with a dark tie, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his demeanor calm yet radiating authority. I recognized him the moment Grandpa Henry introduced him. "This is David Miller, an old friend of mine, as well as a lawyer and family financial advisor." I asked him to review some matters beforehand. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The faint warmth, the dominance of accusations and pressure that my parents and Daria had imposed on me, all of it evaporated. What replaced it was tension, anxiety, nervous glances, shallow breaths. Ethan slid his chair back slightly, his hand gripping the armrest tight, the smug smile wiped clean from his face. Daria went pale, her eyes widening, lips trembling, unable to form words. David Miller walked directly to the head of the table and set down a leather briefcase, unlocking it with a sharp click. Thick stacks of documents were laid neatly onto the polished wooden table, each landing with a heavy thud that echoed in the silence. Adjusting his glasses, his voice came deep and deliberate. "I have conducted a thorough investigation into the loans taken out under the names of Daria Anderson and Ethan Clark over the past 3 years. The results." He looked directly at my parents, then shifted his gaze to the young couple. "Are not what you've been telling Jenna." My heart pounded faster as I found myself stepping closer, drawn in by every word David spoke. "This $450,000 debt," he continued, "has nothing to do with any real estate investment project. In fact, it is the direct result of reckless overspending far beyond their income. Luxury shopping, high-end cars, lavish trips to Las Vegas, and even gambling expenses. I have the full documentation." David Miller slowly opened the thick file, pulling out papers one by one and laying them on the table, each sheet hitting the polished wood like a hammer blow against the facade my family had built. He spread out the bank statements, the bold printed lines spelling out transactions tied to Daria Anderson and Ethan Clark. "This is the January statement," David said, tapping a finger on the page. "Hotel Bellagio in Las Vegas, $25,000. Gambling losses at the casino, $47,000. And here is the invoice for a brand new Porsche Cayenne, under both of your names." He turned more pages, laying down additional receipts for luxury indulgences. Rolex watches, Hermes handbags, vacations to Miami, Cancun, and Paris. "In less than 3 years," David concluded, "the two of you have spent over $1.2 million, most of it through credit loans and mortgages. The $450,000 debt that was placed in front of Jenna," he paused, his gaze locking on my parents, "has nothing to do with real estate investment. It is simply the cost of a wasteful lifestyle." The air in the room grew so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my chest. I looked at Daria. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, but when her eyes met mine, I saw fear and despair, not the cold calculation from before. Ethan, however, exploded. "This is our private business. You have no right to interfere." He slammed his hand down on the table, but David remained calm, his voice steady. "Private business? When you attempt to use Gina as your personal bank to erase your debts, it stops being private. That is systematic exploitation." Grandpa Henry stepped into the center of the room, leaning on his cane, his eyes sharp despite his age. He looked straight at my parents, his voice firm and echoing through the room that had once been their domain. "You've been scheming to turn Jenna into this family's wallet since she was a child. I stayed silent too long, hoping one day you would change. But tonight, before my very eyes, you've revealed your true faces. You don't see her as a daughter, you see her as a financial tool. A living bank. All have." My father trembled, his face drained of color as he stammered. "Dad, it's not what you think." But Henry slammed his cane against the floor, the sharp crack reverberating like thunder. "Enough. Don't you dare make excuses in front of me. I have the evidence, I have the truth, you have nothing left to hide." I stood there, my hands still sticky with wine, but for the first time in my life I felt I was no longer alone. There was someone, my grandfather, who had seen everything, who had stood up for me. A lump rose in my throat, and I nearly broke down in tears, but I forced myself to stay strong. Henry turned to David and gave a firm nod. "I will amend my will immediately. Jenna will be the primary heir. All of my assets, my properties, my shares in the family company will go to her. I will not allow the wealth I built with my sweat and labor to fall into the hands of those who squander and deceive." Helmar. The room erupted like a bomb going off. Daria broke into sobs, her cries echoing in the heavy silence. She fell to her knees before my grandfather, her voice trembling. "Grandpa, I was wrong, I was reckless. Please don't abandon me." But Henry turned his face away, his eyes filled with disappointment. "You have never known how to cherish what you were given. I offered you chances, time and time again. And every time, you chose the wrong path." "Ah!" Ethan exploded in fury, his face burning red as he shouted, "You have no right. This is between me and my wife." But David raised the stack of documents high, his voice firm and commanding. "The evidence is all here. If necessary, I will deliver every page of this to the banks and the authorities. And I assure you, with this proof, Ethan Clark, your creditworthiness will be revoked immediately. Your real estate project will collapse in less than a month." End of. My parents sat frozen, their faces drained of color. They couldn't speak, couldn't argue. Every piece of evidence was undeniable, each signature, each transaction, each figure printed in black and white. It stripped away every lie they had intended to use to trap me. I stood there, for the first time in the house that had rejected me, being defended openly. For the first time, the truth was mine. I looked around and saw Daria with her face buried in tears, Ethan cursing under his breath, my parents hollow and shaken. And me, Jenna, standing tall, the wine drying on my cheek, feeling as though invisible chains had finally fallen away from my shoulders. In that moment, I understood. The cycle had ended. I was no longer the child belittled and exploited. I was no longer a financial tool or a living bank. I was myself, and at last, someone had spoken the truth aloud for the whole world to see. After that Thanksgiving night, what seemed like just a dramatic family dinner quickly spilled beyond the four walls of the suburban Portland house. Word about the debts, about how my parents and Daria had schemed to push the burden onto me, began to leak into the church community, into circles of family, friends, and then across the neighborhood. I didn't have to say a word. What Grandpa Henry and Attorney David had revealed was enough to stir an undercurrent. Whispers spread during Sunday services, at parish council meetings, even in the aisles of the supermarket. That Anderson family? Who would have thought? Turns out all they do is exploit their eldest daughter, a woman murmured. Daria? She spent herself into mountains of debt, and her husband's nothing but a loud bragger. Another man shook his head. The reputation of my parents' once respected pillars of the community collapsed almost overnight. They used to boast about their two daughters, Daria, the beautiful one who was pampered like royalty, and Yena, the successful one, paraded more as proof of their good parenting than as an individual. But now every mask had been ripped away. Friends pulled back, dinner invitations vanished, and the parties they once hosted were no longer spoken of. The very people who used to clap my father on the back in church, who praised my mother at women's meetings, now turned their faces away. No one wanted to be associated with a family exposed for greed and deception. Daria, the sister once celebrated as the perfect princess, became the target of cruel gossip. The photos she posted on social media flaunting luxury cars and designer handbags were now fodder for mockery. The so-called close friends who had crowded her parties slipped away one by one. No one called to shop with her or invite her on trips anymore. She began living in isolation, shutting herself in for days at a time, leaving behind only long, desperate posts on Facebook posts that nobody bothered to comment on. Ethan faced the swiftest and harshest downfall. The bank officially revoked his credit, froze all new loans, and demanded immediate repayment. Investors pulled out, clients turned their backs. Within just a few months, the once boasted real estate projects collapsed one after another. The local paper even ran a story detailing his mounting debts, branding his name with failure and deceit. From a man who had always strutted in flashy confidence, Ethan became a cautionary tale whispered about with disdain in business circles. As for me, after that night, I knew I could never allow myself to be prey again. The moment I returned to Denver, I met with my financial advisor and overhauled my entire banking system. I closed old accounts, opened new ones with double-layered security. I hired my own lawyer to ensure that every future transaction of mine would be protected, inaccessible to anyone seeking to exploit me. I built barriers, not only around my finances but around my spirit. I changed my phone number, blocked emails, erased every channel of contact with my family. Every bridge they might use to pull me back was severed. In the early days, my mother still sent messages, her tone shifting from scolding to pleading. "Jenna, you can't abandon your sister in her time of need. No matter what, we are still family." But when her words met silence, desperation seeped through. "You will regret this. You will see you are wrong." Yet I no longer answered, no longer wavered. Each message, each missed call only hardened my resolve that I had been right to walk away. The community around them gradually turned its back completely. My parents, who had once been invited as honored guests at church events, now sat alone in the back pews. People looked at them with either pity or disdain. Those who had once attended their Thanksgiving dinners now found excuses to avoid them. Neighbors whispered when they passed by, and children began calling Daria the debt princess right outside their front door. The house that used to glow with light and noise grew dark and silent, the curtains always drawn. My family sank into a spiral of isolation, stripped of social standing, stripped of defenders. And within that spiral, I no longer existed as the lifeline they had always counted on. For the first time, they were forced to face the consequences of their own greed and poor choices. In the days that followed, I poured all my energy into work. I took on a major new analysis project for a financial corporation, waking up each morning with a spark of excitement I hadn't felt in years. Each time I finished a report, I no longer thought of how my parents or Daria might use it to boast, or how they might pressure me to share. Success was mine alone now. And the strangest part, I no longer felt a weight pressing down when I looked at my bank balance. I didn't have to hide, didn't have to fear someone in the family trying to drain me, because I had built walls of protection, financial and emotional, that no one could breach. Alongside my work, I began opening myself to the people around me. Rachel, my dearest friend, was the first to notice the change. One evening, as we sat in our usual Denver cafe, she looked at me and smiled. "Jenna, for the first time in years, I see you smile without even a trace of tension." I only smiled back without answering, but inside I knew she was right. I had begun to live, instead of merely existing inside the cage of family. I began taking part in more community activities, supporting a nonprofit that helps young women start businesses, volunteering at a soup kitchen on weekends. In those moments, I met people full of strength and resilience, people who had no blood ties to me, yet gave me a sense of belonging and connection my own family had never offered. I slowly came to realize that family isn't only where we're born. It's also the people who listen, who respect us, and who choose to walk alongside us in life. Grandpa Henry also became an important part of my new life. He called me often, making sure I never felt alone despite the hundreds of miles between us. His voice was warm, steady, and every call ended with words that always brought tears to my eyes. "I'm proud that you chose yourself." I knew those weren't just words of encouragement, they were his acknowledgement that I had broken the toxic cycle he had been powerless to stop for so many years. To me, that meant more than any inheritance or property ever could. There were nights when I sat alone, remembering old memories. The wounds were still there. My heart still tightened sometimes when I thought of the childhood I had lost. But instead of pain, I saw them now as markers of my journey, proof of the path I had taken to grow. I began to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean going back or accepting what was done. Forgiveness is freeing yourself from the chains of the past. I forgave so I no longer had to live in anger, so I could move forward without carrying the weight of old wounds. But forgiveness never meant reopening the door I had already closed. One evening, after finishing my work, I stepped out onto the balcony of my apartment. The city of Denver stretched out before me, skyscrapers glowing against the night sky, streams of headlights flowing endlessly along the roads. I leaned on the railing, inhaled the sharp cold air, and let the wind toss my hair across my face. And I whispered to myself, like a reminder, my worth was never measured on their scale. It has always been in my own choices. Oh, 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 oh. In that moment, I knew I had truly crossed over. I was no longer the small Jenna who was always forced to take care of everyone. I was Jenna, a free woman, strong and brave enough to set boundaries and live true to myself. I turned back inside, closed the door, leaving the city lights shining behind me. But within me too, a light had risen, the light of a new journey, one where I could finally live for myself for the very first time. If you, the one listening to this story, have ever been forced by family or anyone else to carry a responsibility that was never yours, I want to tell you this. True love never comes with coercion. Setting boundaries is not betrayal, it is how you protect and love yourself. Don't be afraid of being called selfish for choosing yourself. Because sometimes, that decision is the very first step toward reclaiming the life you truly deserve. Thank you for listening to Jenna's story. If this story touched you in any way, give it a like and share it with those you care about. I'll see you again in the next stories, broadcast daily on the channel Familial Stories Exposed.